A ruthless judge mocked a 20-year-old in court, dismissing his plea. Minutes later, she was forced to face the truth. The air inside courtroom 4B of the St. Louis County Courthouse was stiff with routine. The kind of routine that numbed the senses, that turned real people into names on a docket and stories into paperwork. Judge Victoria Langford thrived in it. Seated on the high mahogany bench, she adjusted her glasses and glanced at the next case. People v. Malik Davenport, another young defendant, another waste of her time. She exhaled sharply, scanning the file for all of 5 seconds before setting it aside. 20 years old, no priors, charged with resisting arrest. She didn't need to read further. She already knew how this would go. Her voice sliced through the dull hum of the courtroom. State your case. From the defendant's table, Malik sat stiffly beside his public defender, Joel Renshaw, an overworked, underpaid attorney who had long stopped believing in the system he served. Malik, dressed in a cheap button-down and jeans that still smelled like his mother's lavender detergent, tightened his hands into fists beneath the table. His heart pounded against his ribs, but he kept his face blank. He knew how people like her saw people like him. Renshaw cleared his throat. Your Honor, my client was stopped for a broken tail light, but the situation escalated unnecessarily. He was dragged from his vehicle without cause. Judge Langford leaned back in her chair, unimpressed. Mr. Renshaw, let's not waste the court's time with dramatics. The lawyer swallowed, pressing forward. The officers never issued a citation for the tail light. They accused him of being aggressive when he merely asked why he was being ordered out of the car. Langford turned to Malik, her gaze cold and calculating. You resisted, didn't you? Malik gritted his teeth. I was confused. I just asked why they were, and they told you. But you didn't comply. She leaned in, her lips curling. That's resisting, Mr. Davenport. The words hit like a slap. Malik's jaw tensed. His mother's voice echoed in his head. Don't talk back. Just get home safe. But he wasn't safe. Not here. His lawyer stepped in. Your Honor, there's body cam footage that... Langford chuckled, a sharp, humorless sound. Oh, let me guess. This is the part where we hear how it was all a big misunderstanding. That you were polite and cooperative, but somehow 2 trained officers mistook you for a threat? A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Langford was untouchable. She had been doing this for 19 years, and her record was nearly spotless. She wasn't about to let some public defender and a kid who thought he knew his rights change that. I've seen this before, she continued, her voice dripping with condescension. They always say they didn't do anything, that the police just made it up. But somehow they're still in my courtroom. She shook her head and glanced at the bailiff. Let's not waste time. The plea deal stands. 6 months probation, anger management classes, and a fine. Malik clenched his fists, his chest rising and falling with measured breaths. His lawyer whispered, Don't react, let me handle it. But the humiliation burned. 6 months probation, anger management. For what? Asking a question? Langford smirked, her amusement clear. Or you can fight it and risk jail time. A choice that wasn't a choice. But just as she reached for her gavel, a clerk hurried toward her bench, a thick file clutched in her hands. Langford frowned, irritated by the interruption. What is it? The clerk hesitated. You should see this before you rule, Your Honor. The judge snatched the file, flipping through it. The more she read, the tighter her grip became. Her fingers turned white against the pages, because what she was looking at changed everything. Judge Victoria Langford's smirk faded as she scanned the file. Page after page of bodycam screenshots, timestamps, and official statements, but not from the officers, from witnesses, from bystanders, from a man recording across the street, and from Officer Stephen McNally's own patrol partner, who had quietly filed a report contradicting his statement. Langford's grip on the papers tightened. The courtroom remained silent, except for the faint squeak of her chair as she shifted. She had no choice but to acknowledge the interruption now. She inhaled sharply. Mr. Renshaw, approach. Malik's attorney rose cautiously. He'd been in Langford's courtroom enough times to know when something was wrong. She never called attorneys up unless she wanted something hushed. As he reached the bench, she spoke in a low, clipped tone. "Did you know about this?" She tapped the file with a perfectly manicured nail. Renshaw barely glanced at it before answering. "No. If I had, I would have presented it immediately." Langford's jaw tensed. She knew she was on thin ice. The prosecution hadn't disclosed this evidence, which meant one of two things. Either someone had buried it, or she had overlooked it entirely. Either scenario was bad. Langford exhaled through her nose and straightened in her seat. "We'll take a brief recess," the bailiff's voice echoed. "All rise!" The moment she stepped through the door to her chambers, she turned to the court clerk. "Where the hell did this come from?" The woman swallowed. "It was submitted this morning. I didn't think it was urgent." Langford's nostrils flared. A rookie mistake. Or maybe not a mistake at all. Maybe someone was setting her up. She had ruled in favor of officers countless times before. And yet here it was, evidence that could unravel everything. She flipped through the statements again, and her stomach clenched. A store owner had watched from his sidewalk. A young woman had filmed part of it. But the real problem was the body cam footage from Officer Jonathan Ellis. McNally's partner. Ellis's report directly contradicted McNally's. His footage showed Malik's hands were up the entire time. It captured McNally yanking him out of the car without warning, pinning him against the hood, and calling him another mouthy punk. Langford's hands trembled for a brief second before she steadied them. She had already ruled. She had already dismissed Malik. She had already laughed. And now this. There was no way she could sweep it under the rug. Too many eyes had seen it. But she wasn't ready to let a 20-year-old kid make a fool out of her. Langford adjusted her robe and pushed open the chamber doors, returning to her bench with her usual air of authority. "Court is back in session." She turned to the prosecution. The young district attorney, Megan O'Hara, was already standing, her expression carefully neutral. But Langford saw it, the faint panic behind her eyes. She knew. Langford's voice was tight. "Ms. O'Hara, can you explain why this evidence wasn't presented earlier?" O'Hara hesitated, then cleared her throat. "Your Honor, She faltered. She wasn't about to take the fall for this. Instead, she shifted. "The St. Louis PD submitted its evidence in stages. I can only assume there was an oversight in—" Langford's fingers curled against the bench. An oversight. That word wasn't going to save her. Before she could speak, Renshaw cut in. "Your Honor, in light of this evidence, I request an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." Malik turned toward him, stunned. A dismissal? Langford's stomach twisted. She had just made a spectacle of this kid, mocked him in front of the entire courtroom, and now, within minutes, she was expected to do a full reversal? She glanced at Malik, and for the first time, she saw it. Not fear, not frustration. A quiet, steely defiance. He wasn't broken. He wasn't begging. He wasn't desperate for her validation. That infuriated her, but she had no choice. Langford exhaled sharply, gripping her gavel. "All charges against the defendant are dismissed." A stunned silence. Then whispers. Then a murmur that grew into something louder. But Malik wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at her. And in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Exposed. The sound of the gavel striking wood should have ended it. Case dismissed. Charges dropped. But it didn't. Because no one moved. Malik remained seated, his hands clasped together, his breathing steady. His mother, Danielle Davenport, sat behind him, her lips pressed so tight they had lost all color. She had spent the last 30 minutes gripping the armrest of the bench so hard that her nails left imprints in the wood. Joel Renshaw leaned in toward Malik. "It's over," he whispered. "You can go." Malik didn't answer. His eyes stayed on Judge Victoria Langford. She could feel it. His stare. And he wasn't alone. The entire courtroom was looking at her. A woman in the back row muttered. She knew. Langford's fingers curled. She forced herself to sit tall, to maintain control of the room. This was still her courtroom. But then came the sound that made her stomach drop. a chair scraping against the floor. Megan O'Hara, the prosecutor, had stood up. Langford's breath caught. O'Hara smoothed her blazer and turned to address the courtroom. Your Honor, before we adjourn, I'd like to formally request an inquiry into the handling of this case. The room erupted. Gasps. A few audible, "What?" Even the bailiff turned his head slightly, clearly stunned. Langford's face went rigid. Excuse me? O'Hara didn't falter. The suppression of key evidence directly impacted the outcome of this case. And not just this case. She glanced at Renshaw, then back at Langford. I suspect there are others. Langford's vision blurred for a split second. Others? Her stomach twisted. She opened her mouth to respond, but O'Hara wasn't finished. She turned, addressing the court clerk. Miss Brennan, can you confirm when this evidence was received? The young clerk swallowed hard. She looked terrified. She glanced at Langford before speaking. It was delivered this morning, ma'am. O'Hara nodded. But the defense didn't receive it. Brennan hesitated. Another murmur rippled through the courtroom. Langford's fingers dug into the armrest of her chair. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. She had dismissed the case. That should have been the end of it. But instead, O'Hara had just turned the entire courtroom against her. Langford's tone sharpened. Ms. O'Hara, I don't appreciate these implications. O'Hara met her gaze without flinching. With all due respect, Your Honor, it's not about what you appreciate. It's about justice. The words hit like a slap. Langford's chest tightened. She turned to Malik, expecting some vindictive smirk, some smug look of satisfaction, but he just sat there, watching, waiting, like he already knew this wasn't about him anymore, because this was bigger. Judge Victoria Langford gripped the edge of her bench, but the courtroom was slipping from her control. The murmur of voices had turned into an open conversation, one she was no longer leading. Megan O'Hara, now standing tall with the confidence of someone who knew she had the moral high ground, turned to Malik's attorney. Mr. Renshaw, how many of your cases have been handled in this courtroom? Renshaw's eyes flicked to Langford before answering. Too many. O'Hara nodded. And how many times have you felt like your clients never stood a chance? A bitter chuckle escaped from Renshaw's throat. Do you want the number in percentages or just a ballpark figure? The murmurs swelled. Langford's fingers curled into her robe, her knuckles white. She had already dismissed Malik's case. Why wasn't this ending? That's enough, Langford snapped, her voice sharp. This is a courtroom, not a press conference. But the control she was trying to grasp was gone. The press was already outside the courthouse. The damage was done. A voice from the back row spoke. Firm, unwavering. Then maybe it should be. Langford turned sharply. A man in his late 50s, wearing a neatly pressed grey suit, stood up. His badge caught the light. I'm Internal Affairs, he said, stepping forward. And I'd like to have a word. The reality of the situation hit Langford all at once. The court clerk's mistake wasn't just an inconvenience. It had exposed her. Her courtroom, her judgments, her entire career. She had ruled on hundreds of cases involving young men like Malik. How many had been denied justice because she couldn't be bothered to check the details? Her throat was dry as she forced a tight smile. If Internal Affairs has concerns, they can be addressed through proper channels. But the agent, Special Investigator Brian Givens, was already pulling out his phone. They already are. Langford's heartbeat slammed against her ribs. She watched as Givens sent something, a message, a file, before looking back at her with the kind of expression that made her realize this was far from over. And then her courtroom phone rang. The bailiff, who had spent years watching Langford run her courtroom with an iron fist, hesitated before picking it up. He muttered a few words into the receiver, then turned to her. Your Honor, the Chief Justice is on the line. Silence. Langford's spine stiffened. The Chief Justice? Her pulse thundered in her ears. That call should never have come. Not for something as insignificant as this. She swallowed hard. The press was outside. Internal Affairs was here. The case file, the one she should have read before rolling her eyes at Malik, was already spreading through legal networks like wildfire. And now? The highest-ranking judge in the district wanted answers. She felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom as she reached for the phone. Her fingers trembled. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Judge Victoria Langford was on trial. Judge Victoria Langford lifted the receiver with fingers that barely concealed their tremor. The courtroom noise had faded to a low hum, but her mind was loud. "Yes, sir," she said, keeping her voice composed. "I understand." But she didn't. She had no idea how things had escalated this quickly. She had dismissed a case. That should have been the end of it. Instead, Internal Affairs was in her courtroom. The press was outside, and now the Chief Justice was calling her directly. Her grip on the phone tightened. "Understood," she said again, and then the call ended. The silence that followed felt longer than it was. She set the phone down, inhaled sharply, then turned to the courtroom. "Court is adjourned," but no one moved. Because this wasn't over. Outside the courthouse, the air was charged. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled for position, and protesters had already begun to gather. The footage of Malik's arrest, the very evidence she had ignored, was playing on news stations across the country. A reporter, Alicia Vaughan from St. Louis Today, looked directly into the camera. Her voice measured, but firm. "Judge Victoria Langford, known for her tough-on-crime rulings, is facing intense scrutiny today after newly surfaced evidence contradicts her swift dismissal of a case involving 20-year-old Malik Davenport." The clip cut to footage of Malik being pulled from his car, hands raised, eyes wide with fear. Then, the damning part. Langford smirking in court, laughing, mocking. That clip was already viral. Her laughter, once a display of authority, now looked like something sinister. And people were furious. A group of protesters outside the courthouse held signs. "Justice for Malik. Langford must go. How many more?" From inside, Langford stood by her chamber window, watching. Her assistant, Erin Calloway, stood behind her. "Judge," she said carefully, "you might want to avoid the front entrance." Langford turned, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not sneaking out of my own courthouse." But even as she said it, she knew walking out those doors meant facing more than just cameras. It meant facing the reality of what she had done. Back inside the now empty courtroom, Malik sat with his lawyer. His hands were still shaking. He had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. He turned to Joel Renshaw. "What happens now?" Renshaw exhaled. "Now? We sue." Malik blinked. "Sue?" "For unlawful arrest. For emotional distress. For every damn thing they put you through." Malik hesitated. He had come here just trying to clear his name. He hadn't expected all of this, but then he remembered the way Langford had looked at him. The way she had dismissed him so easily. He had spent days reliving those few seconds on the side of the road, hands up, heart pounding, knowing one wrong move could end everything. And she had laughed, his jaw set. "Yeah," he nodded. "Let's do it." Because this wasn't just about him anymore. Victoria Langford had always considered herself untouchable. For 19 years, she had ruled from the bench with unwavering confidence. She never second-guessed a decision, never apologized, never let emotion cloud her judgment. But now she sat in her dimly lit office, the blinds drawn, her desk cluttered with legal briefs and unanswered emails. The walls felt like they were closing in. A news anchor's voice crackled from the small TV mounted in the corner. "The case of Malik Davenport has ignited a national conversation about judicial misconduct and accountability. Judge Victoria Langford is now under investigation for allegations that extend beyond this single case." Langford pressed her fingers to her temples. The footage had spread like wildfire. Her own face, her own smirk, played on every screen. And in every comment section, people were tearing her apart. This is what happens when judges stop seeing people as human beings. She laughed at him. Imagine how many others she's done this to. Langford needs to resign. Immediately. She wanted to tell herself it was just public outrage, that it would blow over in a week. But the legal board's official inquiry had already begun. Her phone buzzed with another email. She didn't even need to check. It was another law firm digging through her past rulings. A knock at her office door made her flinch. Her assistant, Erin Calloway, stepped inside. Her face was pale, her usual professional demeanor replaced by something uncertain. "Judge Langford," she said carefully. "The Chief Justice wants a meeting. Today." Langford swallowed hard. There were only two reasons a Chief Justice called a meeting this urgently: discipline or removal. Outside the courthouse, Malik stood on the steps, surrounded by microphones. He had been briefed on what to say. Keep it simple. Don't get emotional. Stick to the facts. But how could he, when this wasn't just about him? He cleared his throat. "I wasn't the first person this happened to. I probably wouldn't have been the last." A reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch spoke up. "What do you want to happen now?" Malik didn't hesitate. "I want change." Another reporter cut in. "And Judge Langford?" Malik's jaw tightened. He thought of her laughter, the way she dismissed him before even hearing him out, and for a brief second he considered saying exactly what he felt. But instead, he exhaled and met the reporter's gaze. "I just want what's right," because he knew the system would handle Langford. And this time, for the first time, the system had been forced to see him. In a room full of polished suits and unreadable expressions, Victoria Langford sat across from the Chief Justice of the Missouri Supreme Court. The silence in the room felt heavier than any courtroom she had ever presided over. The Chief Justice folded his hands on the desk. His voice was calm but firm. "Judge Langford, we have a problem." She already knew that, but hearing it aloud made it real, and for the first time in her career she had nothing to say. Judge Victoria Langford had never feared a courtroom before, until now. She sat at a long oak table across from a panel of 5 judicial oversight officials. Cameras weren't allowed in this hearing, but it didn't matter. The world was already watching. Her reputation, her career, everything she had built over nearly 2 decades was crumbling in real time. The Chief Justice, a man who had once spoken highly of her rulings, now looked at her with an expression she had never seen before: disappointment. "Judge Langford, this committee has reviewed multiple cases spanning the last 10 years, he said, his voice firm. "And we've identified a pattern." Langford sat motionless, her hands folded tightly in her lap. A pattern. She already knew what he was about to say. A history of dismissing cases like Malik's. A history of siding with law enforcement, even when the evidence was questionable. A history of ruling with arrogance instead of fairness. She had gotten away with it for years. But now? Now she was the one being judged. The Chief Justice glanced down at a file in front of him before speaking again. "Judge Langford, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Her mouth felt dry. For the first time she had no words. Because what could she say? That she hadn't meant for this to happen? That she wasn't the villain people were making her out to be? She had laughed at that boy, dismissed him like he was nothing. And now, because of that, she had become the face of everything wrong with the system. Finally, she swallowed and lifted her chin. "I was doing my job," she said quietly. The Chief Justice didn't look impressed. "Then perhaps it's time for someone else to do it." Langford's stomach twisted. She knew what was coming next. Suspension, or worse, removal. Either way, her career was over. Outside the courthouse, Malik Davenport stood on the steps once again. This time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood dozens of people, family members, legal advocates, other young men who had faced the same kind of treatment but never got the chance to fight back. His hands weren't shaking anymore. A reporter stepped forward. "Malik, Judge Langford is facing disciplinary action. What's your reaction?" He exhaled slowly before answering. "I'm not celebrating." The reporter blinked, surprised. "You're not?" Malik shook his head. "Because this isn't just about me. This is about every person who never got a second chance, who never even got a first." A few people nodded in agreement. "I'm glad the truth came out," he continued. "But one judge losing her job doesn't fix a system." The cameras clicked. The microphones moved closer. "So what happens now?" Another reporter asked. Malik looked over at his mother, who had fought for him every step of the way. He thought about all the people who had stood up for him when he couldn't stand up for himself. He thought about how close he had come to being just another statistic. Then, with steady conviction, he answered, "Now we change things." The reporters kept asking questions, but Malik had already said everything that needed to be said. Because this fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. If this story resonated with you, don't let it end here. Share this message, talk about it, and hold those in power accountable. Change starts with awareness, but it continues with action.